Who is Thomas Sankara? Why are we speaking so highly of a person most Europeans will never hear about until after they leave school, if then? Why is that the case? Thomas Sankara was the kind of leader who inspired as much by his deeds and achievements as he did with his words and grace. A strong-willed man, powerful frame, made all the more powerful by the openness of his mind and progressive nature of his politics. If the world had known more like him, and if the world had let those like him live, many of the injustices and wars and genocides that have occurred since his time would not have happened. In doing my research for this episode, I encountered a very respectable-looking online magazine that painted a completely different picture of Thomas Sankara. The financial departments of this organization were based in colonialist countries. I thank Eshrou for his time and insight. His presence brings authority to the argument, and his passion, authenticity. Thank you, brother. Two on the mic, clocking out. Enjoy.
Dung weche pek kod welo mabiro tu under mic. Dung parodit kod jok mawuoye tu under mic. Seche tin sud buta wawinji tu under mic. Wala wachokre wabed piny biwawinje ero chako moment ndi and a podcast makende.
I'm joined by Eshrou for our second chat on Burkina Faso. Eshrou, thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm doing really well. Very excited to get this next episode of Burkina Faso underway.
Yeah. So in the first one, we kind of did a bit of an introduction to the nation about the transition from a French colonial possession and then how that process took place and the after-war years and so on. We talked a little bit about Thomas Sankara, but I feel, and I think from our conversations you agree as well, that he's kind of deserving of his own episode.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. He is a revolutionary. He was forward thinking. I mean, he for me, he stands up there with the giants in terms of leaders globally, not just in Africa, but globally. His vision and his thoughts and his ideals, they are almost unmatched.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's quite easy for Westerners to look at Nelson Mandela and say visionary, and yeah. All respect to Nelson Mandela. It's just a shame that there are so many other leaders that have managed to take office in African nations, but yet haven't been able to achieve the kind of popularity that Mandela did for a number of reasons. And Thomas Sankara, as you say, very much stands on the shoulder of those individuals as well.
Absolutely, but also I think with Nelson Mandela, and I'm glad that you brought him up, what you got to think about with the case of South Africa, and this is just my own opinion, so people feel free to correct me if you have a difference of opinion when you guys give us feedback on this episode. But what I see with Nelson Mandela, South Africa is a country that was white minority rule, and when we look at the narratives that we get today, they're often from a white patriarchal viewpoint. And with Nelson Mandela's release, there had to be some white Western savior successes allowed there. I think this is why we hear a lot about Nelson Mandela, why we don't hear about Sankara or Nkrumah or Patrice Lumumba or Gaddafi, for example. These guys were silenced, and Gaddafi was a tyrant, but we never hear about the good things that they do.
We kind of talked a little bit about Sankara and his rise, as it were, and it's fair enough. I think people should go back to that first episode about Burkina Faso and listen to what he kind of did in his earlier years and how he became the person that he became. He reached the levels of popularity within the military and within public service that he did. And I think that people should definitely try to find out more about those early years when they can. Where we're going to kind of take off here today is during the presidency of Lamizana, who in many ways helped Thomas Sankara became the person that he became. He helped him by giving him also a position within his government. But there are significant ideological differences between Lamizana and Sankara, and these are quite important, I think, for us to note.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think looking from Lamizana's perspective, he wasn't, in my opinion, and the history books more or less say so. He didn't really have the same inspirational drive to free the country from the West. In my opinion, this is something that Sankara, he drove, the right word, but he, that was his main passion. He wanted. He looked at what the country could offer. He knew that the country didn't need to be dependent, and he was trying to put Burkina Faso on the path of independence.
Here is the importance of ideology over perhaps reactionary pragmatism. And I think Sankara brings a very healthy amount of ideology, but at the same time, he brought with him revolutionary ideas. He didn't limit it just to theory. He had practical solutions that he wanted really to push through. And this kind of set him very much against the previous governments, because they would talk the talk, but they didn't walk the walk. Whereas Sankara, he was, from day one when he became a minister, he was walking the walk.
Absolutely. Let's remember that he improved literacy rates in the country. He improved or increased the amount of female membership within the parliamentary ranks. He believed that women were crucial to the decision-making process, and quite rightly so. I mean, there were vaccination programs, we know, that he put in. I think that the biggest one of all, one of the challenges that we still have today, is to make clean water available for all. I mean, the African continent has many things. Clean water is one of them, but getting it delivered to the peoples seems to be a challenge.
And these are very much policies which he pursued. We'll talk a little bit more about them as he becomes president and how he brought these about. Between Lamizana, however, and Sankara was Colonel Zaire Zerbo. And he took over in 1980. And so between 1980 and 1982, that's where when he was then deposed, and then he was replaced by somebody called Ouedraogo, and then he set up the Conseil de Salut du Peuple, so the Council for the Health of the People, or something like this. That's how I've translated it in French. So there is a very turbulent period here.
Absolutely, I think that this is where we see the transitional period of Burkina Faso, and there were very short stints in between the change of presidencies. I think there's only like a 2 or 3 year period there. We've had 3 changes, ending with Sankara before his untimely assassination.
Yeah, absolutely. And what it also serves to highlight is the fact that in none of these other coups was Sankara himself a prominent participant. He didn't want to be involved in the destruction of a government, or involved in any kind of unsavory, shall we say, actions that may have taken place. He wanted perhaps there to be a peaceful transition. He wanted there to be a transition of understanding. He wanted to be somebody who he didn't inspire hate. He wanted to be a unifier. That's what I want to say. He had no problem being controversial, but he wanted to unify people.
Well, let's have it right. Thomas Sankara, he had been on the front lines. He had seen blood. Often the greatest, well, not necessarily always, but more often than not, the better leaders are people that have seen conflict and understand what conflict's about. We only have to look towards the leaders in the US and America. Today, they've never seen any conflict, and they're all gung-ho for war. But he had seen it, and he believed that the only way forward was peaceful solutions, and it was something that he was adamant about doing.
So then we go into this situation where, again, there is a need for people to be, shall we say, slightly rebellious in the way that they manage things. And it's interesting also why Sankara then has to come in the place of Ouedraogo. I tell you, it sounds a bit Portuguese, but clearly it's not. But it gives me that impression.
Yes, it does, and I think that it might even be. I mean, let's remember that the Portuguese did have quite a big influence on various parts of Africa. I believe Mozambique was one country, but the Portuguese had a big influence on the continent. So I wouldn't be surprised with a few words that came over.
And during the time of Ouedraogo, Sankara, he doesn't even stay the whole time in Burkina Faso. He's there traveling around socialist to communist countries. He's getting ideas. He's developing relations, seeing how other leaders have done things, seeing how they have to live with things, seeing the people of other places. He's really an international man of the people. And that's also impressive.
Well, this is interesting that you mentioned that, because we mentioned Colonel Gaddafi last episode and how he and Sankara, they didn't really see eye to eye, or he didn't really. Many years later, when Colonel Gaddafi decided that he wanted to turn Libya into something of a functioning democracy, he did exactly the same thing. He traveled the world and he met leaders of democratic countries, and he was studying the different forms of democracy which he wanted to implement. And this, again, shows you how far ahead of his time that Sankara was. Very much a visionary, very much a visionary.
It's also good that you mentioned Gaddafi, because on his way back, he also visits Libya. I think Libya was one of the last places that he visited in this tour of his. And what's very interesting is that the president of the Ivory Coast, and I can't wait to talk about the Ivory Coast, the president at the time, Felix Houphouët-Boigny, he is extremely concerned about the relationship between senior politicians in Burkina Faso and Libya. He wants them to completely change their focus away from Libya, which is interesting.
Absolutely. I think they may have been something, which I'm only speculating here, but it may have been something between the two countries at that particular time, which caused them to feel that way.
There's definitely this element where the Ivory Coast, at this point at least, continued to be very much under the influence of France, and Libya was perhaps not quite so under the influence.
Absolutely. I've been to the Ivory Coast. I was there in the earlier part of this year, Abidjan. I went to the African Cup of Nations with a friend of mine. So we actually saw the final. Anyway, but that's another story. But yeah, there was a lot of the French influence. North Africa and France have had their a very turbulent time, and I believe Libya was one of the countries that was able to escape the clutches of the French. Tunisia and Morocco, not so much, and Algeria. Of course.
Yeah. So at some point, the president Ouedraogo apparently entertains this the need to deliver a speech or a presentation, and there's at the same time there is a rally where Sankara is speaking, and apparently Sankara spoke for hours because he wanted to embarrass the president. Because at some point, everybody left the president's speech, as it were, and went to listen to Sankara. And the next day, the president meets with a guy called Guy Pen, who's a French representative of President Mitterrand's government. And then on May the 16th, Ouedraogo purges his government of pro-Libyan and anti-French elements. He disbands the Popular Communist Party and has Sankara and others arrested. So when we want to talk about the potential influence that France tried to impose on these countries, I can't say that's a coincidence that he has a meeting on one day with the French representatives, and then the next day he does it.
Well, let's look at that particular time, and we can go back just before that also. I mean, we are in a Cold War period, right? And America, who more or less ran this side of the world, were very concerned that parts of Africa may end up under Soviet rule. They wouldn't allow it to happen. So, of course, they did their best to, disrupt what they could to ensure that African nations didn't sway towards the Soviet countries. Because let's also remember, Maoist China and parts of the Soviet Union under various leaders, they supported and championed a lot of the African nations. They supported and championed a lot of the African Americans under pressure in the US. So these things didn't bode well for the US. So working obviously with the French, who, let's have it right, their banking system and the French-speaking parts of Africa are interlocked. If they lose that, a lot of their economy, if not the entire economy, will fall because they take so much out of these African countries and their banking system to keep their, currency and economy afloat. So that they don't want to lose that.
And they still don't want to lose it, unfortunately. No.
Well, we know the reason why they got rid of Gaddafi and who was behind it, Sarkozy and Cameron, and of course that's a story for another time. But again, losing parts of various countries in Africa will be detrimental for the ailing currencies of Europe and the US.
Yeah. So, cut a long story short, at some point there is a coup which is led by Compaoré, who was the only one of these leaders that Ouedraogo wasn't able to capture, and he returns to Po, where he has this military academy, and then he instigates a coup. So Sankara is thereafter returned as president, and this is where we start to see some of the policies that we have been talking about really come into effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's remember he wasn't around for very long. He had a very, very short stint. It was only a 4-year period. Okay. And, in the early 80s, when he took office, he was able to set up, literally made the country self-sufficient in food. I mean, that is almost unheard of in African nations. Even today, in 2024, African nations are still importing. And a lot of that has to do with IMF loan policy, etc. But again, that's a story for another time. But, he put the health of the country first, and he led the country by showing them how they should be healthy. He never drove around in a government car. Where when he could cycle, he rode a bike. It was just to show people that this is who I am. I'm the same as you. Hey, and I'm taking care of my health at the same time as I'm taking care of you in the country, right? Again, vaccines was important. God knows how many lives he saved the children. I think the number was it over 1 million or 2 million children, I believe?
2.5 million he vaccinated. There
you go. And I mean, those were lives saved by doing that. And again, unheard of, self-sufficient back in the 80s. Some African countries are still not achieving that today. And you have to ask why that is. And again, clean running water. This is something that's been crucial and problematic for African nations. So when you look at a lot of the waterborne diseases that plague some nations, and the fact that he was able to do that back then, he set, if you will, a blueprint for African nations to copy. He was the blueprint. And for that particular reason, he became dangerous. African nations are not supposed to be dependent. No matter what people say, we got to stop blaming the West, we got to stop blaming. Whenever they lend money from the IMF, that money comes with strings attached. Those strings attached can mean various things. And one of the things that it definitely means is that they never really get to develop. It keeps them in an underdeveloped state. He broke away from that. He became the blueprint. Years later, Colonel Gaddafi was setting something in motion. He didn't quite realize what he was trying to do because, he didn't make it.
It's really interesting you made those points because these are some of the policy highlights that I also picked up. So let's quickly go into some of the motivations behind this. So Sankara made a point of declaring to the world, he who feeds you controls you. And that really emphasizes the point you're making. If you feed yourself, you control yourself. You are independent as a result.
Absolutely. I mean, we know the story of what happened to Ghana with the rice, how Ghana produced a lot of rice. It was able to produce enough rice to feed itself, but then they needed money in order to kickstart some of the programs. So on one of the conditions that the IMF loaned them the money was that they would have to allow products to be sold within their markets from the US and various other countries globally. What did the US do? Flooded the Ghanaian market with their cheaper rice, which literally put their rice out of business, and they couldn't then produce their own rice. Again, this is the danger of the IMF. And again, whoever feeds you controls you, right? So lend the money, strings are attached, but hey, you've got to take this food from us now. You can't grow your own food. It's a bit backwards in thinking. So it is 100% correct.
Also picking up on what you were mentioning before with regards to literacy, just to give a bit of a value so that people can understand exactly what was achieved. There was a literacy rate in 1983 of 13%, 1-3.
Yes.
After Sankara, so as in when he came in, by 1987, in 4 years' time, that jumps to 73%. That is comparable with the USA.
Like I said earlier, this is a blueprint. He set out the blueprint, and people in Washington and Whitehall and Paris, they're looking what's going on, and they're thinking, if he's able to achieve this on very little, maybe with the backing of the Soviets, maybe with the backing of the Chinese at that particular time, we don't know. But it's become very much of a danger. The cash cow that is Africa, the cash cow that is the continent of Africa, will cease to exist. And of course, they then put something into motion in order to stop that from moving forward. But I just wanted to add very quickly something that came to mind just now while we're talking about it. Sankara witnessed firsthand the suffering wrought by hunger in Burkina Faso. Somewhere between the 60s and the 80s, about 100,000 people died through famine. And again, this was something that he'd seen, and he wanted to get beyond that and control food production for himself.
Also referring to some of the things that we've mentioned before, 10 million trees were planted to prevent desertification. And again, to highlight the fact, without foreign aid, he had roads built, railways were improved, the country's circulation and distribution networks were also improved. All of this without foreign aid.
And this, again, very, very scary to, again, the US, the ones that hold the purse strings, the IMF, the World Bank. I believe that just a couple of days ago, the new leader, Ibrahim Traore, was offered a loan from the IMF to do something around mining within the country, and he's refused the loan. Now, we know Gaddafi did exactly the same thing, right? When he built the man-made river, do you know that?
No.
Right, very briefly. They found a lot of fresh water aquifers deep down in the ground in Libya. He wanted to get the water from the ground to the people. So upon letting the world know that they found this water, the IMF reached out and said, look, we'll lend you some money to complete the project. And Gaddafi told them, no, we can do this because we have our gold and oil reserves that we can pay for it ourselves. And they offered several times, and he says, no. Anyway, he built this irrigation system that drew the water up, and it distributed the water to all the towns around Libya. Now, you know, the North Africa is very arid. Every single house in Libya was able to receive water just by a project that he built called the Man-Made River. Please Google that, guys. And when NATO bombed Libya, what do you think the first thing that they did when they bombed Libya? The Man-Made River. They completely cut the water source off from the people. And they said it was an accident. Of course, we know it wasn't an accident. It was part of a strategy for the people. I think I'm digressing here, but I think the point I'm trying to say is that the IMF does more damage or more harm than it does good.
Yep.
And people should understand that.
Indeed. And I think we've also highlighted the need to quite soon discuss Libya in dispatches.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they are crucial to Africa's development. I mean, he took the country from one of the poorest to the richest country, one of the richest countries in Africa at a point, and he did it all himself. Very similar to, again, as I said, Sankara was just before him, and then I believe that he looked back and thought, this is what he's trying to do, and probably used the same programs and implemented them within the country.
Another thing which is interesting because it makes Sankara comparable to Mossadegh, who we've also mentioned before from Iran in 1953, is that Sankara introduced agrarian reform, redistributing land from the feudal landlords to the peasantry. Now, this is what Mossadegh did in 52-53, and obviously the West were extremely angry about this because they did not want normal people to become landlords and landladies and people of some kind of economic power or whatever. No, they wanted to keep the poor, and that was it.
Well, you can see that a very similar thing is happening here now in the West, right? I mean, if you look at something I was reading this morning, it's very difficult for a lot of people now to buy property in many large cities across the globe. It's becoming more and more expensive. One of the reasons for that is because these private equity firms have been buying up properties in bulk. and artificially highlighting, pushing up the prices, the vanguards and the Black Rocks of the world. So it's a very similar process. They tried and tested this in Africa and the Middle East. And once they perfected it in these places, then they tried on us over here in the West, once nobody can do anything about it. So, they want to keep, they've deliberately kept people in that region in turmoil and poor. And we can see it happening here in the industrialized cities across the globe. Very similar process, tried and tested in the 50s and 60s on people in poor regions.
And the direct result of the policy of land redistribution, agrarian land redistribution, is that wheat production rose in 3 years from 1,700 kilos per hectare to 3,800 kilograms per hectare, making the country food self-sufficient without foreign aid. Once again, I really want to stress this point.
I'll add to that the blueprints, right? He's mapping, he's letting people know, look, we can do this for ourselves. Yeah, we do not need anybody else to do it for us. Okay, I think you said for Sankara, food and health. It didn't simply mean choice or to choose specific diet, but it was a freedom to be completely self-sufficient, which makes sense in the way that we live now, right? We need two things: we need health, and we need good food and a roof over our heads, and then we can improve our lives.
With regards to the blueprint as well, and also how, by extension, that blueprint made him dangerous to the interests of the West. When he was in Addis Ababa, he spoke against arming African nations against one another and said that they had to cooperate. So clearly, this Pan-African policy that he wanted to introduce and wanted to extend, which still exists today, and I believe is the one policy route which a lot of African nations really should pursue. He said, let's produce what we need and consume what we produce instead of importing goods. And he went on to say, I simply want to say that we must accept to live the African way. It's the only way to live in freedom and with dignity. And these are important points.
They are very much important points, but there's I think I wanted to add that if you want to live in peace, you have to prepare for war. I'm not sure if you've ever heard that saying before, but this is more or less it. He was against African nations being armed. Of course, there were some very scrupulous people in the background that ensure that to keep people fighting, that they can then control what it is these people have. But I think Sankara, he saw above that. He looked at a part communist ideal where we don't consume more than we need, right? It's not so much a capitalist way of thinking, and this goes back to his education. But he saw a way, let's not produce more than we need, just produce what we need. And then we can deal with all the other things that we need to deal with. It isn't about overconsumption, whereas the West or the industrialized nations are built upon overconsumption. Most of the things that we produce and buy, we don't need. It's just there in abundance, keeps the prices inflated and high, and it only benefits a small group of people at the top, not everybody in society as a whole.
Indeed. And he truly was somebody who championed the whole of society. And this is why we also look at, or he addressed the inequality of women, in which you made reference to before. And what's interesting is he says, we are willing to welcome all suggestions from anywhere in the world that will help us to promote the full development and prosperity of the women of Burkina Faso. As in, I do not know any other leader that would possibly say, tell me how I can improve. If there's something I haven't tried, tell me what it is and I will do it. That's brilliant.
And again, this is almost direct democracy, right? And again, this is something that Colonel Gaddafi wanted to implement within Libya. He, that instead of saying, elect me and for the next 5 years, I'll continue doing what I like, and I might do a couple of things that you like, but I'm going to do what I like over here or service this group of people. Having a dialogue with the people of the country, the people that do the hard work. How do you want to improve your nation? How do you want the nation to benefit? This is the way forward, right? And again, Africa, in my opinion, if you look back through African history, and you don't have to go too far back, you can probably just go back over the last 100 years, 150 years. But if you look at African history, the leaders have always been more or less visionaries. They've always seen a world very different to the world that you and I know today here in the industrialized world. They've always viewed and seen the world in a sense of equality. They've always looked at ecological solutions to sustainable solutions to a lot of the problems that we have in the world. And a lot of the industrialized nations look at what they were doing and bring it here and, you know, pass it off as their own. But Africa, I think, is the continent itself. And again, it's not unique. I'm sure if you look around parts of South America and parts of Asia, people were doing very similar things, right? But I think the idea and the notion that the West has created and has been the best or the greatest or the you know, for me, that's a lot of them are just tall tales. I think if you look at Africa, prime example, I'm going to sway just a little bit. My family are Jamaican, as you know, and been to Jamaica many times, and you have these dreads and these Rastafarians in Jamaica called the Nyabingi. Now the Nyabingi dreads, they don't drink, they don't smoke, and when these guys eat, they don't eat meat. Sometimes they eat fish, but the food that they prepare is the original vegan food. Original. They were like the first vegans, literally the first vegans. I'm not saying, of course, the first vegans ever, but their entire diet is based on veganism. And this is where many countries here in the developed world have taken ideas from and passed off as their own.
Well, at least they've taken some of the positive things that were there for them to actually explore and expand upon. It's just a shame that we've forgotten about it ever since then, or at
Absolutely.
least people like myself have, unfortunately. And so therefore, there's always something that I can... What was a clear warning shot that Sankara sent out in when he addressed the 39th session of the UN General Assembly? He said that he spoke out on behalf of a people which, on the land of its ancestors, has chosen from now on to assert itself and to take responsibility for its own history. Now, these probably sent out a few alarm signals to certain people, certain leaders around the world, but they probably thought to themselves, you know what, there are many African leaders who say this kind of thing, but then they just do what we want. But in his case, that didn't happen.
No, he knew what he wanted. He knew that the only way that he could truly, and his people, be free would be to break the chains of colonialism and be independent from and of the West. And again, this sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in the industrialized nations, the powerful ones at least anyway. And I think Britain, France, and America are always going to be the three that stick out most of all for me, because they had and still have very much an influence in parts of Africa. Again, different shockwaves, and it's something that they needed to nip in the bud.
And unfortunately, this is where now we move towards, because we've talked about how the promise that he made at the beginning. We've talked about the policies that he's introduced. Now let's talk about how unfortunately he came to his end. And there was treachery from within the camp. The person, his ally, the one person who he had always created room for alongside him, Compaore, was essentially turned by President Boigny, I think it was, who introduced him or promoted a relationship between Compaore and his goddaughter, Chantal Terrasson de Faugerès, I believe. And she opened up a world of wealth and luxury to Compaore, and this world completely contradicted the revolutionary ideals of his very good friend Sankara. And I think at that point, he no longer wanted, or he was no longer so committed to those ideals. And bit by bit, he kind of turned around and said, actually, I want a bit more from life.
Yes, I think the stories differ. Or since, let's just say, we'll get varying degrees or varying accounts, but I think Compaore stated that officially that Sankara jeopardized foreign relations with, as you mentioned before, France on the Ivory Coast, and that's kind of what led to his downfall. But I've heard several different accounts on his death, so it's very difficult to know what the truth is.
Unfortunately. But what we can be absolutely clear upon is that Compaore was responsible for the assassination. Absolutely. He was questioned about it. I'm not sure he necessarily, I haven't seen any interview where he says, yes, I did it, but he was asked directly, do you regret it? And his response was, I regret that Sankara turned away from the revolution. or from something like this? And that is very hard to believe, isn't it?
Well, of course, absolutely. He's going to save that to save face, right? But I think that we, as you say, Campari was complicit. That's something we can definitely be certain of. But he won't really accept full responsibility, even though I read somewhere that he apparently apologized for the death, although I'm not sure how true that is. But let's just say that money, power, and it always gets the better of some good men.
Indeed. What should also be commented, just in case there's any kind of doubt as to which foreign nations were, shall we say, complicit in this as well, because I don't think Campari would have done it if he didn't have the support of foreign nations. Campari ended up ruling for about 25 years. And he maintained close relations with France, I believe, at the time, over that period, and also the Ivory Coast, I'm sure a few others. But we will come back to Campari's rule, as it were, in our next episode about Burkina Faso, because there's just so much to talk about with regards to Burkina Faso. But Esra, I'm going to ask you to give for this episode, your positive thoughts about Burkina Faso, of which you have many, as a conclusion, if you may.
Absolutely. I think, as I said earlier, if you look back at African history, you can, see that there've always been revolutionary leaders that have always been visionaries. And I think Burkina Faso, and you've heard me say the word several times today, that they mapped out or laid out a blueprint of what African nations could be. Each nation in Africa can be self-sufficient. And as a continent, they really don't need anybody. The world needs Africa. Africa doesn't need the world. And I think it only takes for African leaders to come together and let the world know that this is how the game's going to be played from now on, and allow the world to sit up and take notice.
Thank you very much again, Esra, for your time. I know time is very much not on our side at the present time, but the fact that you keep coming back and talking to me, your commitment to this project suggests there's a lot to talk about. So I thank you very much for it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me once again.
Two and a mic. Two.